Pam Bondi, loyal, and yet fired. President Trump's personal attorney, Todd Blanche, named acting attorney general. And yes, this is part of the Epstein fallout. Day 2 in space for Artemis II high Earth orbit, and moments ago, and all systems go for its flight to and around the moon. President Trump's primetime address did not, as some expected, say anything about leaving NATO. So what's the future of the alliance? We asked Trump's first NATO ambassador, Kate Bailey Hutchison. Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to the Takeout. You are expecting me to talk about Pam Bondi. I will. But first, I can't help myself. Let me mention Edmund Randolph, our nation's first Attorney General. Randolph represents two enduring standards for the Attorney General. The first, a close relationship with the President. Randolph, a Virginian like George Washington, was also vital to Federalist priorities that prevailed at the Constitutional Convention. The second, neutrality and independence. Now, back then, the Attorney General did not have battalions of attorneys and federal prosecutorial clout to wield. But it did have a choice to make about whether or not to wade into policy and politics. Randolph studiously stayed out of frays between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson during Washington's first term, solidifying that the Attorney General was different than other cabinet members, arm's length, when at all possible, from politics. That precedent, like so many in Washington's presidency, influenced attitudes and behavior for generations. Now, look, we have had politically charged and politically attached attorneys general before. Robert Kennedy was President John Kennedy's brother and guarded his interest intensely at the Department of Justice. John Mitchell was President Richard Nixon's campaign manager in 1968 and 1972, and deeply embedded in Watergate wrongdoing. Eric Holder was fiercely loyal to President Barack Obama, so much so, the Republican House voted to hold him in contempt. 17 House Democrats, by the way, voted in favor of that. But no attorney general, and it's not close, was more loyal to the president than Pam Bondi. She brought him to the Justice Department and declared that department basically worked for him. A rhetorical compromising of independence soon followed by investigations and attempted prosecutions that hewed so closely to public instructions from the president that any sense of discretion dissolved. Often, and this is important, in ways that undermined the cases themselves. Grand juries refused to indict, charges were reduced or dropped entirely. Thousands of career lawyers left the DOJ, unwilling to bend to these new dictates. Bondi's handling of the Epstein files was, by any measure, unserious. The preparation of binders handed to conservative influencers at the White House last year was a farce. Comments about Jeffrey Epstein's client list being released, well, as the kids say, did not age well.
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump. I'm reviewing that. I'm reviewing JFK files, MLK files. That's all in the process of being reviewed because that was done at the directive of the president from all of these agencies.
The Justice Department has not complied in full with the Epstein Transparency Act, the one President Trump signed. It's one of the reasons the House Oversight Committee, on a bipartisan basis, subpoenaed Bondi to testify April 14th. Does Bondi's ouster mean that subpoena goes away? The White House may hope so, but Congress will most definitely have a say. For more on Bondi's firing, we turn to Nancy Cordes at the White House. Nancy, take it away.
Major, this is something that the president had been mulling for quite some time. He made it clear in social media posts online that he was frustrated with the pace of prosecutions against his enemies. You'll recall there was even that one infamous moment where he posted something that seemed like maybe it was meant to be private. He said, "Come on, Pam, let's get going on these cases." And yet we saw case after case fall apart for the reasons that you mentioned, because there wasn't enough evidence, because they were put together shoddily, because there were career prosecutors who said they didn't want to work on those cases. They didn't believe that they were valid. And, that irked the president of the United States, who had certain expectations coming into office. And Pam Bondi had stated that she was 100% behind those expectations. But there's just so much that an attorney general can do, even when they are as fiercely loyal as Bondi was. We're all familiar with those clips of her heading to Capitol Hill and going after members of Congress who questioned her or questioned the president. What sets her apart from other top officials who have left this administration is that she is someone who was solidly in the president's corner for years. She was a member of his impeachment defense team. She held a very public role as an attack dog back in 2020 and 21, basically out there making the case for President Trump's baseless claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election. And so the fact that he is now easing her out of this very high-profile role is notable.
Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general, there was a bit of reporting, ours and elsewhere, that Lee Zeldin, the current EPA administrator, might be tapped as the next attorney general. Still no word from the White House about who the president will nominate for confirmation.
And that could still happen. Todd Blanche is someone the president is very comfortable with, like Bondi. He's a longtime loyalist. He was a defense attorney for the president. He's been serving as number 2 at DOJ. So it's going to be pretty easy for him to step into the role. The question is, will the president eventually nominate him to be AG, or will he pick someone else like Zeldin?
Nancy Cordes, North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so very, very much. We turn now to Jake Rosen, Justice Department reporter. Jake, this, as Nancy said, was kind of brewing for 2 days, which is somewhat unusual in the Trump universe. Typically, if the president wants to fire you, it happens rapidly. This was a process where it seemed as if there was a window for the attorney general to resign if she wanted to avoid being fired. She did not take that.
And she did not. And like Nancy pointed out, she has been somebody who was one of the first major players in the Florida political space to endorse President Trump back in 2016. She's someone who I ran into as a campaign reporter back on the trail in 2023 and 2024, appearing at events with the RNC to talk about things like election integrity and the other major priorities that the Trump campaign was pitching to voters. And I think that underlines kind of what's so unusual about today is that she did so many things by the book and by the direction of President Trump. She worked on and defended with a lack of resources, less talented attorneys by any measure, because the career prosecutors and attorneys have been stripped out, fired, or resigned, and then had to go placate judges around the country and defend policies that were either unlawful or just simply had to actually have real legal merit put behind them, not just a true social. And for over the last 16 months or so, we've really covered all these cases in depth, and it was clear that her department was failing at doing a lot of those day-to-day things. That's just not going to change no matter who's in charge of the DOJ going forward.
In her defense, the outgoing attorney general posted on social media today that crime rates are down, that immigration prosecutions are up, and that she's got a record that she's proud of. There is something that has happened under her watch at the Justice Department that she does point to.
Oh, absolutely. And those things are absolutely true. It's the same for what can be said when Kash Patel touts his statistics or Kristi Noem. The problem was there were distractions that were inevitable. The constant stepping on a rake when it came to the Epstein files, as you pointed out in your monologue, was something that she teed up unprompted at the beginning, right after being confirmed. It was something that then the DOJ tied a bow on with Kash Patel. Dan Bongino said to voters who had voted for President Trump and the most transparent administration in history, as they branded it right away, that there was nothing to see there. There was nothing worth investigating.
No prosecutions to follow up on.
And 6 months into the administration, basically saying, we did our best, looked into this. That placated nobody, unsurprisingly. But at the same time, not only did you have to walk that back, Major, the power dynamic among DOJ became pretty clear when, among the later stage of the Epstein files revelations in the DOJ, it was Deputy Attorney General, now Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, who was the one talking to reporters. It was Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche going to meet with Ghislaine Maxwell at that prison. Some of those more high-profile moments where you want the Attorney General defending her stances in the administration and her decisions that she had to take. I also think about just the number of immigration cases, the number of DOJ reporters that, or DOJ lawyers that have been either held in contempt or threatened to be held in contempt. When you have an administration like this, which is pushing so hard on so many different fronts at the same time to try to undo what they see as either weaponization or judges, activist judges in their way, or rogue policies that have been put in their way, there just hasn't been an appetite among the laws and the rules that we have in this country and the people who enforce them to do that. And it's been a really constant one getting batted down right after another in the day-to-day playing landscape of the DOJ that makes it so untenable for somebody like Bondi, even though she's a loyalist, even though she'd done so many things right, to stick around.
The president pushes for results. They often have opinions behind those sought results, but when those opinions are tested in court, either on the law or the facts, they oftentimes fall apart or get severely weakened. That's a fact. Jake Rosen, appreciate the help. Thank you very much. Artemis II, given the green light to proceed with the most critical part of its mission, slingshot around the moon. The translunar injection burn, that's what it's called, is scheduled for later tonight. That rocket boost will set the spacecraft outbound toward the moon, and if successful, further into space than any astronauts in history. It's very important stuff. CBS News senior transportation correspondent Chris Van Cleve joins me now from Houston's Johnson Space Center, where we got the word about, an hour and a half ago, Chris?
Yeah, Major, just after about 4:15, so just about an hour ago, we heard from Mission Control that this translunar injection burn, TLI, was a go, and that's big news. That means this Artemis II mission is headed for the moon. And that burn's going to happen in the next couple of hours and then sets up about a 4-day trip before sort of the main event of this mission occurs, when the astronauts will do their flyby the moon and in fact be in a position to see the far side of the moon, perhaps see parts of the moon that no human eyes have ever seen before, and they'll have an opportunity to document it. So think back to the Apollo missions, some of those iconic photos of the moon and the Earth. What kind of iconic images might they be able to capture on this trip that will define the Artemis missions for a generation to come?
And you accurately described it as the main event, the slingshot around the moon. But if you think about it in boxing terms, there's always a really good undercard fight before the main event. And the undercard was this decision today, because this was really central to the future of this mission. If you can't do this, then you're coming back home.
That's right. Now, they did have a little bit of wiggle room. If there was something they didn't like, they could have opted to do another 24-hour orbit around the Earth to try to troubleshoot that and make this decision again tomorrow. So far, it sounds like there are no major issues, no concerns, so they're moving forward. But yeah, Major, this was sort of make or break. If there's no TLI burn, you're not going to the moon, you are coming home.
And what have we heard so far from the crew?
Not a lot. We heard from the mission commander about the ride up, and he said it was pretty incredible. We heard from the pilot after they spent about 90 minutes hand flying the capsule, Orion, for the first time ever in space. He described the sound of the thrusters a bit like being on a bumpy road. It performed as more or less as they expected it to, and he said part of the goal of doing that was to relay back the sensations, the feel, the handling, so they have a better understanding of how it flies and how that compares to the modeling. You know, they've been flying this in a simulator, but had never flown it in space. So this was a big moment. They're going to do some more hand flying later in the mission. And we're going to hear from the astronauts. We're supposed to hear from the astronauts and the crew later tonight, which will be probably the first at-length conversation with the astronauts we've had the pleasure of hearing.
And they will have some good news to talk about. Chris Van Cleve, great stuff today and really great stuff yesterday. My thanks to you, sir, very much. Retired NASA astronaut David Hilmers joins me now. He flew 4 space shuttle missions and was inducted in 2024 into the U.S. Astronaut Hall of Fame. It's great to have you with us. So you just heard Chris Van Cleve and I talk about all systems go for this super big burn to go around the moon. Help my audience understand its importance.
Well, this is the first step in getting us back with boots on the ground on the moon. It's kind of analogous, as many people have said, to Apollo 8, where we flew around the moon in preparation for landing on the moon. And with the new revamped Artemis program that was just discussed a few weeks ago, we'll be having a mission the next mission will be somewhat similar to Apollo 9, where they did a low Earth orbit kind of dress rehearsal for going back to the moon. So this is the first step. If this doesn't work, we're kind of back to the drawing board.
Right. And your experience, space shuttle, this is already something that's a little bit higher and more ambitious, but you've been in space, they're in space now. Give my audience a sense of what the crew is working on, what the crew is anticipating.
So they had a really busy first day. Ascent is always really dramatic. It was kind of similar to my days in the space shuttle because they used a lot of refurbished and updated shuttle parts on the solid rocket boosters and the main engines. So that was kind of familiar to the shuttle days. But they had a pretty flawless flight so far. They had a little problem with the toilet, which has been one of the most troublesome things that we've had. Back in my day, we were always having trouble with the toilet, always doing little fixes. And sometimes we had to revert to what was called the Apollo bags, where the toilet wasn't working, so we'd have to use bags to do our business. Then I think they had a little bit of a glitch with communications, but that was quickly fixed. And then they had a very successful piloting exercise, which is really critical to be able to do rendezvous and proximity operations. And so apparently that went really well, and the Orion vehicle performed very, very well. So the next couple of days, once they do the TLI burn, and I think that's scheduled for a couple hours from now, they'll basically be coasting to the moon. And the big thing will be just to make sure that all the life support equipment is working well, the oxygen system, the carbon dioxide scrubbers, and like we said, most of all, the toilet, that
Right.
it's working so that they can maintain a deep space presence without any problems.
Are you as excited as many people are about what they're about to see if they make it around that far side of the moon? Because that's quite different from your experience. I'm sure your experience was amazing, but they're looking forward to something pretty incredible.
Yeah, so it's looking back at the Earth is absolutely amazing, and every astronaut that's ever been in space will say that that was by far the most impactful experience that they had. Is just looking back at the Earth, but the moon is something really incredible. So, from what I understand, that they'll be seen in daylight parts of the far side of the moon that have never been seen before. They'll be doing a lot of photography to look for a landing base on the South Pole, where we think that there's water. So that will probably be the landing site in future missions. And then they'll be, of course, looking at successful reentry. A couple of things that they will be doing that just quickly, one will be testing out a new communication system. There's so much data coming back from the moon on these types of missions, technical data, medical data, that they need a higher bandwidth, higher channel capacity communication system. So they'll be using laser frequency, very high frequency. The higher the frequency, the more data you can get back. So they'll be testing that out. They'll also be looking at something very exciting from I'm a medical doctor, looking at something called organ on a chip, where they'll be able to test out putting someone's cells onto a chip, and then being able to develop a digital twin of who you are. And then instead of testing yourself under very extreme conditions or radiation, you can test this chip and it will predict what kind of response you will have. Really exciting stuff.
David Hilmers, you have 5 academic degrees, one of the most academically achieved astronauts in American history, and you just gave us 2 data points that are super fascinating. I appreciate the time. Thank you very much. President Trump, in his address to the nation last night, said the U.S. operation in Iran will end, quote, very shortly. Here's what the president said you should expect, meaning all of us, in the weeks ahead.
We're going to hit them extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong.
Kay Bailey Hutchinson joins me now. She served as ambassador to NATO during President Trump's first term. She also represented the great state of Texas in the United States Senate for almost 20 years. That's where our paths very frequently crossed. it's sort of endemic on me to call you Senator Hutchinson, but I'll call you Ambassador Hutchinson. It's great to have you on the show. I'm sure you watched the president's address last night. Did you learn anything from it that you didn't already know?
Thank you, Major. It is great to see you again. I've met you many times through our careers, and thank you for having me. Yes, I think it was really important that he talked to the nation on the importance of this for the long term. You know, really, the president is making a decision that isn't in his political interests, but it is in the long-term security interests of our country. And I think he was bringing that home to the populace, saying it is going to be a little longer. Yes, I understand about high gas prices, but this is a price that we must pay so that we don't have long-range missiles that can reach America with a nuclear warhead.
There were some who anticipated and some who feared the president might make an announcement about NATO, like withdrawing the country, which he has suggested on social media he was giving serious consideration to. How do you evaluate those threats?
I think it will be very important for the president to meet with the Secretary General next week, which I think is on the book. And
just announced today.
Talk through what has to be done to bring everybody back together. I would hope that a short-term tension does not unravel a defense alliance that is the most important and successful defense alliance in the history of the world, and it still has great merit, and it should be patched back together so that the Western countries that share our values will be an alliance that is unbreakable.
It is, as you said, Ambassador, Senator Hutchinson, a defensive alliance. The president leading the United States, Benjamin Netanyahu leading the state of Israel, launched a war against Iran for lots of reasons they've explained. That's offensive. NATO's a defensive alliance. And many nations have said, that's not our war. That's disappointed the president. How would you, if you were counseling the president on this particular area of disappointment, walk him through that?
I think it is important that we look at NATO as a deterrence alliance. It is meant, and America is the one that will assess a risk and then begin to stop that risk from occurring. And what we saw, and I saw it when I was at NATO, that Iran was cheating on the Iranian nuclear agreement. They were trying to get the nuclear capability to make a bomb, and we withdrew. And we said, look, Iran is also doing ballistic missiles that could reach us and you, and therefore we've got to deter against this. But the Europeans said no. The long-range missiles were not in the agreement. Well, that was a technicality, but now, because we have waited, we are on the brink of them having the capability to hit Europe right now. They just showed it last week, and also having the cheating on continuing to do nuclear enrichment.
Do you think this will be over, as the president indicated last night, in 2 or 3 weeks, or do you think Iran's going to have a vote and this may last longer?
I think that we should never try to predict the end of a war. We've got to predict what we must achieve, but not try to put a timetable on it, because I think we have been surprised by Iran's response. The other neighbors in the region are also surprised. So trying to put an end date on a war is probably not a good strategy, but putting the possibilities of an end in place and know what the goals are is an important strategy. I think the goals are clear. No nuclear weapons and no ballistic missiles that could hit Europe or the United States or Japan or Australia.
Former Senator, former Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchinson, a pleasure. Great to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Major.
Still to come on the Takeout. A couple is arrested for using a hospice center to defraud Medicare of millions. We have exclusive access to today's FBI raid. Also, Florida Republican Congresswoman Maria Salazar. We discuss the state of U.S. relations with Cuba, the DHS shutdown, which continues, and a lot more. Plus, the crowded race to be the next governor of California. I will speak with the Riverside County Sheriff, who believes he can be the state's first Republican governor since Arnold Schwarzenegger. The Takeout returns in 90 seconds. Welcome back to The Takeout. The FBI arrested 8 people in California connected to a $60 million healthcare fraud scheme. It includes a couple accused of billing Medicare nearly $8 million for their hospice service that, interestingly, had a 97% survival rate over 5 years. Now, that is quite evidently a red flag for fraud investigators. Why? Well, because, as you know, most patients enter hospice care in the final stages of a terminal illness. That's what hospice is all about. It's why it's valued by so many people. Prosecutors say these arrests are part of a much larger effort from the Trump administration to combat fraud where they might find it.
No more. No more. The whole of government, including all of the great partners on this stage, is focused on unmasking the criminal actors who are exploiting the American taxpayer.
CBS News correspondent Adam Yamaguchi had the exclusive at the scene of one of the arrests today. Walk us through what you saw, Adam.
Good afternoon, Major. So we were at the scene early this morning as federal agents executed an arrest warrant of a couple, Gladwin and Amy Lou Gill, who were accused of running a fraudulent hospice, doing business as St. Francis Palliative Care. Now, they were billing Medicare for $5 million for services they never rendered. Now, this hospice is located in Glendale, California, which is among that heavily clustered concentration of hospices in LA County that we've been looking at. But the arrests were made at the couple's property nearly 30 miles away in a large gated home in an affluent neighborhood in the hills.
So, Adam, break down how this alleged scheme, the allegations around it, played out.
Yeah, so the DOJ accuses the husband and wife, this is a psychologist and his nurse, of paying kickbacks to recruiters who would go out and they'd find people who are willing to enroll in home health care in exchange for $300 a month. The nurse would then add notes to their patient records to make it appear that those patients actually required hospice, even though they were nowhere near the end of life. So meanwhile, the hospice would then bill Medicare for thousands each month for each patient, totaling over $5 million in about 3 years. And what ultimately tipped off the feds was a former registered nurse who had been fired, according to the complaint, refused to follow MD orders when they refused to admit a patient that did not need or qualify for hospice care. Investigators would later interview 22 patients enrolled in that hospice. None of them said they were dying, nor did they realize that they'd signed up for hospice.
Adam Yamaguchi, fascinating details. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. Coming up, the U.S. has eased an oil blockade on Cuba, at least a little bit, just a little bit, to try to help improve the energy crisis there. I will next speak with Florida Republican Congresswoman Maria Salazar about that topic, which is very much on her mind, and TPS status for Venezuelans. That's also on her mind. That's next right here on The Takeout. Welcome back. Russia said today it plans to send a second oil tanker to Cuba. Earlier this week, the United States allowed the first shipment of oil from Russia to pass through its blockade, in part as a humanitarian gesture to address a very deep and deepening energy crisis in Cuba. I want to bring in Florida Republican Congresswoman Maria Salazar. How comfortable or uncomfortable are you, Congresswoman, with this decision on a case-by-case basis? That's the administration's phraseology, to allow Russian oil, not Venezuelan, not Mexican, but Russian oil into Cuba.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's uncomfortable, but I understand it. You know, it's just a little Band-Aid to a very big wound that was created over 65 years of communism on that island. So one shipment is not really going to solve anything. It's just going to buy 5 or 6 more days. Remember that the whole electric grid collapsed because it hasn't been taken care of for decades. And the Trump administration is correct. It's time for regime change. There we need regime change. And it's part of the America First agenda. If you want to, we can discuss that. But the regime that is in place right now needs to go because they broke it. They cannot fix it.
There are opportunities, though, to take oil from Mexico or our new partner, as the president describes it, Venezuela. Russia is quite clearly an adversary of ours right now, but they profit from this. Why Russia?
Well, maybe because Russia wanted to. I really don't want to speculate, but remember that Russia had a very long relationship with the Castro regime for many years. I am sure that Vladimir Putin is not going to put his relationship with Donald Trump on any type of situation where it will be antagonistic towards the president or the White House. I'm sure the White House said, okay, like I said, one shipment is really not going to solve anything while we finish with the situation and the conflict we have with Iran. But President Trump had said it many times and clearly, and for my constituents and my community, that is music to our ears, that Cuba is next. Because Cuba is only 90 miles away from Miami, the district that I represent. And we do need regime change there so we can have a whole Western hemisphere free of the socialist and the Marxist and the communist influences. That's America First agenda for sure.
Delcy Rodriguez, the administration announced yesterday sanctions will be lifted against her. She now runs Venezuela. Are you comfortable with that? And I know you want and you've appealed to the president to address temporary protected status for Venezuelans in your district.
Yeah.
Address both of those.
Yeah, that's correct. And, I'm one of the leaders on immigration. No, I'm not comfortable because Delcy is part of the thieves and the people who destroyed Venezuela. Is just that this is a new blueprint that the president is putting together, which we have never seen, but it's working, where we are sort of telling the bad guys, including Delcy, you are going to prepare the runway and you're going to prepare all the conditions so the good guys, the opposition leaders, the people who are pro-democracy, pro-free market economy, be able to land and then create free and fair elections with international observers and have the Venezuelans rule themselves. Delcy Rodriguez is just a short-term solution to a problem that could be bigger because although we do not want a civil war in Venezuela, we want to be able to access the largest reserves of oil in the world that they own. So she is a thief. But we're going to give it a little bit more time for her to behave and to conduct business the way that is convenient for the Americans.
And
until we have elections.
And temporary protected status for Venezuelans in your district. Some of them face deportation.
Yes.
You want them to be able to stay.
Yes, I do, because they came in legally. The United States government gave them sort of a pass for them to stay until the conditions are ripe. And until they can go back and be able to work and have democracy and free, fair elections. The rule of law is not going to be able to be part of the whole Venezuelan scenario if we don't have elections. And for these people, millions of Venezuelans, many of them live in my district, to be able to go back and have a job and be prosperous individuals of that society, they need to have a rule of law. They need to have clear rules of the game. And that's not happening right now. But it's true. And we have to go back to what Marco Rubio said. This is first stabilize, recovery, and transition. And we're recovering. So let's see when transition happens. And for me, transition is transitioning back to democracy.
And in the meantime, don't deport Venezuelans in your district.
Correct. And I have said it clearly many times to the Trump administration. I'm a proud Republican, but I have told them many times, and I've come to your show to say to the Trump administration and to my colleagues in the House of Representatives that we need to do immigration in another fashion. And that's why I wrote the dignity bill. And that's what I've been saying. Let them stay for a little while, the Haitians and the Venezuelans and some of the Cubans, because they're going to be able to go back home soon, but not right now. So, yes, I'm defending my district within,
Congresswoman, Republican Maria Salazar.
Space.
Thank you, as always, for being on the program. I appreciate it.
Wonderful to be with you. Thank you. Of course. My pleasure.
It's a case that strikes at one of the most fundamental questions in our country. Who is a citizen? challenge to President Trump's executive order that seeks to overturn what we know to be birthright citizenship. A look at the arguments before the Supreme Court yesterday and where the High Court appears to be heading. That's next, right here on The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. In our federal system, the Supreme Court is kind of a fortress of history and grandeur. Yesterday got a little bit more historic. President Trump became the first president to sit through at least part of oral arguments on a case sitting before the court. The question, the future of birthright citizenship, which this president very much set in motion. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson joins me now. Jessica, always good to see you. I don't typically memorize the number of executive orders, but I have committed this one to memory, 14160, because it sort of cuts to a core question about American citizenship and how we define ourselves as a country. How did it go at the court yesterday?
So I think that it did not go well for President Trump. Major, as you know, we always have to be careful about reading too much into oral argument. But I think the reason it didn't go well is because this, as you know, is a conservative court, and they read the Constitution in what's called an originalist way. What do the words of the Constitution mean when they were added to the Constitution? When the 14th Amendment, for instance, was ratified in 1868, because we're talking about part of the 14th Amendment here. How have we historically read those terms? I think all of those inquiries would indicate that the president cannot, by executive order, seek to redefine the Constitution, meaning seek to redefine the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship clause. So I do think some people were surprised by the questions and how it, as you know, the justices asked tough questions on both sides, but I still think this is 7-2, 8-1 against the administration.
There's a moment that struck me, probably struck you, Jessica, when the Chief Justice, talking to the Solicitor General, John Sauer, who was describing what he said is a modern problem, a modern defect, in that there is so-called birth tourism, to which the Chief Justice said, it's a new world, it's the same Constitution.
I think that was the quote of the oral arguments yesterday. And actually, I think that explains so well what we were just talking about, which is an originalist perspective is that the meaning of the Constitution should be read, again, at the time the words were written and maybe informed by historical tradition. That's when we talk about gun control cases. We talk about the Second Amendment and the history and tradition test. The same thing really is true for the word liberty in the 14th Amendment, all of which is to say it was a great pithy line, but it actually embraced so much, which is, yes, different world, but same Constitution. And I'm an originalist. And this is why the Chief Justice is, because he says it's not my role to put meaning that I might want into the Constitution. It's my role to interpret it.
Jessica Levinson, always a pleasure. Thank you so very much. We're about a month away from early voting and the beginning of that in California's race for governor. Up next, I will be joined by one of the Republican candidates that may benefit from a crowded Democratic field. You're watching The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Last time California elected a Republican as governor, that was 20 years ago when Arnold Schwarzenegger was reelected. I covered the recall election in 2003 when he ran the first time and won. This year, Republicans think they have a chance to end that very long, 2-decade-long dry spell, thanks to a very crowded field to see there of Democratic candidates and the state's top 2 primary system that puts the top 2 in the primary into the general. So, joining us right now, one of those candidates on the Republican side, Riverside County Sheriff Chad Bianco. And we should emphasize that everyone you just saw on the screen, welcome to be on this program. But Sheriff Bianco was the first one to accept our invitation. Sheriff, it's good to see you. Let me talk to you about news of the day. President fired Pam Bondi as Attorney General. Was that a sign of strength or weakness?
Boy, I don't know. That kind of came out of the blue. I've met Pam several times. I think she's done a great job. It's obviously been a very tumultuous year and several months that she's been there. But that came out of the blue. For a law enforcement perspective, she's done very well by us. been very responsive to us. And in our world, especially in the major county sheriff's world, she's going to be missed.
From your vantage point, did you see or detect anything that justified her being fired?
No, but I also don't want to speculate. I don't know what's going on in Washington, D.C., behind the scenes. And we get what we get from the media, both sides, and we try and decipher what it is in the middle. And I don't know if we'll ever know. Both of them, I've seen both comments from both the president and from Ms. Bondi, and they've both been positive. So I don't think it's something major. I think it might be, it's new and it's big. So I think we might be making a bigger deal out of it than maybe what we should, but that remains to be seen.
Understood. What would you say to Republicans who are trying to decide in California between you and Steve Hilton? Why are you a better choice?
I'm a lifelong Republican. I'm the only one on the Republican side. You only have a choice between me and Steve. There are a couple of other Republicans, but we have to be realistic and see who has a chance of winning. And in the end, I have a lifelong past of irrefutable public service and Republican conservative values and beliefs. And Steve does not. His have completely changed for his own personal benefit or political benefit. And I think people are seeing through that relatively quickly. So I think the choice is very clear. We definitely need a Republican. And right now, I'm the only Republican running.
He says you knelt at a Black Lives Matter rally in 2020.
Yeah, the truth of that is every major city was burning at that time. And what city didn't burn? Mine, because I was the first law enforcement officer leader in the country to use overwhelming force to eliminate them from my city. When they showed up, we had 10,000 at their protests when they showed up here, and we eliminated from our city within an hour, and they've never come back. That's the reality of how I feel about violent protests and BLM. And regardless of what Steve wants to pay and get people to believe, when you attack your opponent, you know you're losing and you're just trying to bring your opponent down. But the reality is people, especially in Riverside County, know what happened. It's not what happened that day. I'll pray any day. They asked us to pray for the safety of our deputies because they knew what was coming. We prayed. It worked out well because there were no deputy injuries when we removed them from our city.
Sheriff, why did you seize ballots from the most recently conducted election in your county dealing with the redistricting question?
We have an investigation. We were presented evidence. Our investigators moved on that evidence. We asked questions. It came to a point where the only option where we were going to find the truth was to count those ballots. So we went to a judge. The judge agreed, and he issued that warrant for us to seize those ballots. It's very plain and simple. It's no different than any other investigation that we start, and it's not going to be any different than any investigation that we finish unless politics and a failed attorney general come into play. Sheriff, and they're able to stop it. Hide it.
Let me jump in on that. 40 seconds. Why not let the public know the justification for those warrants, unseal them so they can evaluate, as you did, the underlying reason?
Oh, yeah, we're getting them unsealed. This is another play on politics. That most warrants are sealed in the beginning because we don't want that information getting out before we have an opportunity to seize the evidence that we're looking for. We've already told the judge to unseal the ballot or the warrant. It's up to him. We couldn't care less.
Chad Bianco, Riverside County Sheriff, candidate for governor in California. I appreciate the time, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Happy Thursday, everyone. You know what this is? The Takeout. Quick reminder, we are relentlessly curious, reliably civil, occasionally clever. Daily Report, coming your way next.